Welcome from whichever time zone or part of the world that you're in. For the next hour or so, you're at the London School of Economics in a conversation with me, that's Stephan Chambers, who runs the Marshall Institute at the LSE, and some friends and colleagues and alumni of the program that we run. And we've rather ambitiously framed this conversation as about career transitions. So I'm guessing you're in the room because you're thinking about making a career transition. You've made one and want to share your experiences, or you're struggling, as it were, to find the means to think through how one does this. So I thought that for the next hour or so, we would try to share our experience of what this means. And there are one or two things that I'm going to assume as kind of givens or priors. One is that when I think about this kind of transition, I'm talking about transitioning from one role to another or from one sector to another, but always into an impact role. In other words, I'm not talking about moving from making the world a better place into making the world a worse place. I'm always going to assume that it's the other way round. Okay, so I'm going to take as given that I think we're all really interested in impact and social purpose, and addressing things that we think are unjust or unfair or destabilizing in some way. And I'm going to try and make one or two distinctions. But before I do that, I'll just very briefly say that I am a triple jumper. So I have moved continents, I've moved sectors, and I've moved roles over the last 40-something years. Okay, and I think it's important that you think about what it is you're trying to do. So are you trying to change roles in the same sector? Are you trying to change roles and sectors? And are you trying to change roles, sectors, and countries? And of course, 3 is harder than 2 and 2 is harder than 1. Okay, but they're all possible. And you'll meet some people today who've done variations on these things. So the first thing to say is that I have spent a long time helping students, both my last life in Oxford and my current life at LSE, make this kind of transition. And I always say to them, the very first thing I always say to them is, decide what it is you're solving for. Okay, because if you don't know that, okay, you're probably not going to transition successfully. So if you really secretly want to earn more money, but don't make that an explicit goal of your transition, you'll probably be unhappy because people won't register that that's important, or you won't behave in such a way that that's important. Similarly, if you really, really want to work on something that is analytical rather than interactive, you have to be clear that that's what you want. So step one is have some sense of what you're solving for. Step two, which is also really difficult, is have some sense of how the world frames you. Okay, you may think of yourself as the most gregarious and outward-facing person, but the world may frame you as someone who is the opposite because of what you used to do. So have a really clear-sighted sense of how you think you will be perceived by virtue of your current role. Okay? And then third, and in some senses easiest, put yourselves in the minds of the people on whom you will depend to do the new thing. Okay, so don't treat the world as if it is somehow at fault if it doesn't recognize your unique talent. Okay, treat the world as if you really want to understand what it is that they're looking for when they're choosing to hire. And a brilliant example of this is lots of people say to us, I want to move into impact investing. Yeah, this is a very good example of this kind of phenomenon. Okay, and you'll all on the call know what impact investing means, but essentially, just in shorthand, it means making investments on behalf of other people where the return comes either in money, either in social benefit and money, or social benefit or money. And people say, I want to work in that because it combines all the things I care most about. It's finance and it's public benefit. You have to be really clear whether you will be seen by the hirers as a finance person, okay, who's got to grips with impact, or an impact person who's got to grips with finance, okay? But you can't be neither, okay? You can't be neither, because there will be plenty of finance people who think they've learned about impact, and there'll be plenty of impact people who think they've learned enough finance. So you have to position yourself somewhere on that spectrum, okay? And you probably have to position yourself somewhere on that spectrum, which is hard, you know, where it's hard to get that kind of comparative advantage. And, you know, the world is full of people who know how to do complex valuation exercises, but the world is not full of people who really understand what we mean when we talk about impact, okay, and how to make, as it were, impact-related adjustments in respect of risk and return. So that's an example of the kind of transition we're talking about. Know what you're solving for, know how you will be framed as a result of what you currently do, and think yourselves into the minds of the people who are making the hire, okay? And then use the programs that you're on, or the things that you're currently doing, to start accumulating capital in the direction that you're heading, okay? So if you're heading into impact investing and there are opportunities to take courses on that, or opportunities to expose yourself to that way of thinking in your current role, okay, or opportunities to go to the LSE and do a program like ours that, as it were, equips you with some of these things, then take them and build it up as a kind of slow program. So that, I mean, I could talk forever about this, but I promised people that I wouldn't talk forever. So what I'm going to suggest I do now is ask each of my colleagues to introduce themselves and describe a little bit about their move from one country, sector, role to another in order, and then ask you to start thinking about questions that you can then address to us, and we'll try our best to answer them. So I'm going to ask Emily if she would go first and tell us a bit about what you did, why you came to the LSE, what you now do, and how you found that process.
Thanks, Stefan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So yeah, my name's Emily Hobel, and I'm the head of growth at Founders Pledge. Founders Pledge is a non-profit that supports tech founders with their philanthropy. So the typical profile of people we work with would be Series A or Series B founders who are potentially going to make millions or billions and want to give some money away, but don't really know how to do it in the best way. I started my career studying international relations, and then did a couple of internships at some nonprofits. And then I spent about 6 years working in foreign direct investment for the Mayor of London, so public sector, before then doing the Masters in Social Business and Entrepreneurship at the LSE, and then transitioning, I suppose, back to my previous life of nonprofits, although with a huge amount of more knowledge than I had the first time round when I was doing it. The other transition that I've made is, as Stefan was saying, continents. So I grew up in London, did most of my career in London, and then about 2 months ago moved to Vancouver. So that has been a shift as well. Thinking about kind of how I made that shift, I think for me, a large amount of it was about transferable skills. So I was doing a business development partnership style role for the Mayor of London. And so I really lent on those skills and applied to similar roles within the nonprofit sector, which I suppose at least meant that I wasn't transitioning the role element of what I was doing. It was more about the sector and the context. Another really important part of how I managed it was not hiding my existing sector experience. I think, especially in nonprofits, you often end up with a lot of people who have spent their whole career working in nonprofits, but actually, a large amount of what we learned about on the course was that you need people from all different sectors to really enable that collaboration. And so leveraging the fact that you have experience from a different sector and you can bring a new perspective, I think was really, really valuable as well. A couple of other things to mention. One is that I think often when you're making this shift, people talk about networking and meeting people and connections. For me, the biggest unlocker of that was actually learning more about how I like to network and how I like to build relationships, because if, you know, I'm not a super extroverted person who loves going to big conferences and events. I much prefer smaller one-to-one interactions. And so if I was doing all that conference stuff, I would definitely end up burnt out. So learning earlier rather than later as to how you like to build those lasting relationships, I think was a game changer for me. And then, of course, doing the course. I mean, honestly, I don't think I could have made the transition that I did if I hadn't done the master's, which I completed in 2021. It just really adds a huge amount of, I guess, a lot of kind of robustness when you're talking about these terms and you're talking about new sector lingo, and you can really actually speak with some level of authority. So that was a big kind of unlocker, I suppose, and the springboard really to give me the confidence to start applying to these impact roles.
Thank you, Emily. Just on the networking point, I mean, I think that's very important, because everybody says it's all about networking. Personally, I don't think that's true. I think that we need to adjust the terminology a little bit. It's all about having the confidence to differentiate yourself and to accumulate genuine expertise and genuine reputation and genuine capital in the area that you want to move into. Sandra, hello.
Hi, guys. I'm Sandra. Thanks for joining. So for me, I think my transition went from private to social enterprise and then back to private with a twist. And I'll explain how that is. So I started my career off in consulting in the US. Then I moved to Ghana, where I'm originally from, into telco. And then from telco, moved into social enterprise in Ghana. And now I'm currently talking to you from Dublin in Ireland, and I'm back in private sector at Google. But basically it's private sector, but I'm looking after emerging markets. So there is still that element of taking all the lessons from the course into something private, but that has a big impact on Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North Africa, on Israel, and then also in Turkey, which is some of the markets that my team and I look after. Currently, I'm the head of emerging markets at Google, and basically what we do is we support publishers with their monetizing their websites and their apps, and basically getting users into the digital age, and figuring out how the web and how apps can support them in their businesses and in their lives. I think the transition for me was I always was a private sector person, but I wanted it to be private sector that has an impact. So not just for the money, but really, how can you really, at the end of it, look at what the end user is getting out of this? And that for me has always been the thread that has run through my career so far. And I think in my current role, I'm really able to do that because, you're able to see a publisher that has no idea how to monetize. And in 6 months to a year, 18 months, you can see them starting to really thrive and try new things and be open to, supporting. I think where the course was really useful for me, I can see it in two ways. One was, I came into digital advertising, Google, with no experience on digital advertising. My whole, career before that was, supporting organizations like UNICEF and, USAID and so on. But one of the key things I picked up from the course was learning how to work with teams, and also being able to ask the right questions, even when you don't have, necessarily firsthand information. So being able to rely on the team for those who know, and then being able to leverage your superpower, which, I really think is a superpower, to like not know everything. So Emily, to your point about, for folks who have been in nonprofit all their lives, for you to come in with something different and to be able to like add to that flavor. I think that's where my superpower was. I came in not knowing about digital advertising, and therefore I was able to like challenge and to probe and to ask like, well, why are we doing it this way? And does it really work for the publisher in the emerging markets? Because even if it works in Europe, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for a publisher, say in Morocco, right? So I think for me, those are some of the key things that really made a difference. What I would say that when you're looking at your transition as well, Stefan, I think you made a point about like, know like what you're doing it for and like where you stand and how, folks are going to see you. I think on that one, my trajectory has been slightly different because I think there's also space in all of that to be a generalist with a slight edge. And what I mean by that is it's okay if you're not the go-to person for like finance or impact investing or, and you know a little bit about everything. I think, you should be able to tell where your leaning is, even if you don't have the full gamut, right? And for me, I think my superpower is partnerships, right? I love, talking to people and understanding what they're doing, why they're doing it. And oh, by the way, have you considered XYZ? And I can connect you to so-and-so who's in, this other, country who's doing something similar. So I think that, while you're considering a transition, also think about, what you're interested in, even if you don't have a specific, focus, you should just have a leaning, and that's okay. There is room in the world for that. And that's been the case for me.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm going to come back to you, Sandra, and to Emily after we've heard from Hannah, just to talk about one really, really basic thing, which is I think you've all moved continents at least once, and some of you 3 times. Just this question of, because presumably you have sponsored visas when you do that. So somebody has to say, we want to hire this person for this reason and this, and therefore they are visa eligible. So that's another kind of frame to test the realism of your transition, I think. Hannah, welcome.
Thanks, Stefan, and hi everyone. I'm Hannah Cotmore-Scott. My career path has followed a squiggly one, I guess, or there's been a significant change. I started out studying engineering, which I never actually went and worked in, but found it fascinating as an initial undergraduate subject. From there, I decided to go and work for Deloitte. So I worked in their corporate finance function, or financial advisory function as it became, basically working with them on failing companies. And I did that because I wanted to get the accountancy qualification, because I really had no idea what I wanted to do. So I thought I'll go and do something that could be useful. After 3 years doing that, I knew it wasn't really for me. But I also knew that I wanted to do one of the jumps of the triple jump that Stefan referred to, which was to move continent. And I wanted to go to New York. So I decided to stick with the job because, again, just referring back to that visa thing, I had no way of living in the US unless someone paid for my visa. So I kind of probably took a hit with regard to exactly the content of what I wanted to be doing for the place that I wanted to be in the country and continent that I wanted to explore for that period. And I was in New York for almost 4 years, during which time I did do the LSE course because I was even more sure at that point that I was not in the career that I wanted to be in, doing what I wanted to be doing for the reasons that I was doing it. I then COVID kind of struck, and it was the a good moment for me to say, okay, enough is enough. Although I love this place and this continent, I'm gonna go back to London where I can work on, I have right to work and I can change career, change jobs, and that's what triggered me to do the master's in the first place, that opportunity. And I moved back to the UK and I switched to the public sector, which I'll come back to kind of why and how I made that transition. But I started working for an organisation called UK Government Investments. They are owned by the UK Treasury, but they basically look after all government assets, so anything nationalised, so Channel 4, the the post office. Probably shouldn't mention that one at the moment, but yeah, a lot of government assets. And the thing that I did for them was actually very similar to what I did at Deloitte, which was helping with regard to failing companies, but from a totally different perspective and with a different mission. And since then, I've switched jobs again, only relatively recently in the last couple of months, and I've moved into the Treasury, where I now run 2 teams. One is a team of economists who focus on like microeconomic analysis for the Treasury, and the other is kind of on that government asset stuff, which relates back to what my first public sector organisation, UK Government Investments, did. And I mentioned the kind of detail on that because you can see at each step of my transition, there's a commonality. Not everything is the same, but there is something the same between them. And I think, you know, when I moved to the US, I kept the same job. When I moved back to London, I kept the same skill set, but did a different job. I then switched from UKGI to the Treasury, and I kept the same skill set and the same sector, but did a different role. So although I actually am a triple jumper, in Stefan's terms, I've done it all one jump at a time. And I think that made a lot of sense for me. At the end of the Masters, I applied to MSF to work with them. And I found that the job they offered me was 3 jumps probably at the same time. And what that meant was I was taking a major step back in my career progress to date. And so I think it's not impossible, and you are able to translate that experience that you've had and try and speak in the languages of the new sector. And I think the Masters is very good at helping you do that. But you have to expect that if you're going to make 3 jumps at the same time, there's going to be a cost to that. And so I decided to take a different route, which is kind of, one small stepping stone at a time. Just on the Masters, and then I'll hand back to you, Stefan. I think the key thing that it did for me was broaden my horizons. I had never, ever thought about working in the public sector before I did the Masters. I had thought about the third sector, the social sector, and obviously I had been in the private sector. But actually, that's maybe not true, but the public sector as an entity, I'd thought about maybe going and working in the NHS and like specific things. But I'd never thought about just joining the civil service and being part of that. And the people on the course, as well as the content on the course, really broadened my horizons and gave me perspective of the different things that are out there.
Thank you, Hannah. Super helpful. You mentioned just now, the kind of cost of some of these decisions, and I want to address one of kind of the I guess you would call it the kind of elephant in the room when people are talking about purposeful careers. There is a very widespread notion, and indeed I've just seen there is a question in the Q&A that there's a trade-off here that you have to somehow be poorer and work harder and have less kind of evolved corporate culture in order to work in a social enterprise or in an NGO or in a charity, as compared to the more conventional private sector career trajectory, where, I don't know, share options and bonus schemes and as it were, kind of evolved HR policies are much more the norm, particularly in large professional service firms. Do any of you want to talk about that particular elephant? Because, I mean, my own view is it's not necessarily true that these trade-offs exist or that you have to, as it were, trade down in terms of professionalism. But it'd be interesting to hear your views. I mean, Hannah, you brought up the cost question. I mean, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, I think when I referred to cost in that particular transition, I was thinking the cost of my progression. Yeah. Accepting that you can't, I personally haven't seen where you can change all of those things at once and not expect to kind of go back, go back a few years. I think in terms of like the actual cost question, from my perspective, if I was still in the job that I was doing at Deloitte, yes, I would be being paid more. But would I be enjoying my career? No. Would I be valuing the work that I did? No. And would I be able to get myself out of bed in the morning to go and do it? I honestly don't know. And so I think if you are the type of person that you can do, it depends what you're driven by. I was like, I can't sit at Deloitte and become partner here because I'm not driven by the work that I do, and I won't excel here. And when it comes to Sandra's like superpowers, it's the same thing. What is your superpower? And my superpower is not just getting up in the morning to do anything if I don't think that is valuable and going to add benefit somewhere in the system. So for me, that was not the path that I could follow to the best of my ability. But yeah, there is a purely financial loss, but in many other ways, significant gain to that shift from my life's perspective.
Yeah. I mean, your answer is pretty much what I meant when I said rule one is decide what it is you're solving for. Because the shortcut to being unhappy and unfulfilled, and therefore probably not very good, is not to be clear and honest with yourself and everyone else about that. So if you want to get paid a lot, okay, don't take a job that doesn't pay a lot, because sooner or later those two things will be in tension. And I guess one answer to the anonymous Q&A question is, there are people, the effective altruists, the 80,000 hours movement, there are people who really believe that the right thing to do is to earn as much as possible for the first half of your career, and then to spend the second half of your career putting that financial return to good public use. Okay, personally, I think that's a bonkers position, but there are lots of people who do believe that. I guess, Sandra, you went in the other direction. You went to, as it were, a highly evolved, global and remunerative corporation from something that was less so.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for days on this. I think for me, it's a case of, I always knew that I wanted to do, I think in full transparency, I don't think anybody wants to be poor, right? I mean, making a healthy living is important to me, but not at the cost of not being able to get out of bed. So for me, my goal was to make sure that I found something that satisfied both. Because I think if I was able to get out of bed and wasn't, paid, what I thought I was worth, I would be unhappy. And if at the same time, if I was paid a lot and it just, work was like a pain to get to, then that would also make me unhappy. So for me, the balance was really important. I think the interesting thing about my path was that the cost that we're speaking of was not a cost in terms of going back in a few paces, but it was actually the word that comes to mind is capacity, right? So the cost of actually going from managing, being a country director for a social enterprise to managing a team in a very big organization. So you had to, come in with, or you had to build extra capacity and more resilience, because the style of managing was different. The culture was different. The impact was all there, and everybody is brilliant, right? So it was a case of, really enlarging your cup to fit into that, and then to show value, right? To show, showcase all the ways that your superpower, could come into play. So for me, I think it was more of a case of having to really expand and build new capacity and new resilience. But, can it be done? It can absolutely be done. And I think, again, you should be open to the idea that, it could be going up or going down, and make sure that the balance of it, you're okay with it. I think that's really, really important to think about.
Yeah. Emily, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think mine is maybe less drastic because I went from kind of public sector to non-profit. So I think they're probably, in terms of literal cost and salary and things like that, probably not massively different. But I would say that when I was thinking about non-profit roles, I think there's often this perception that non-profits shouldn't spend loads of money on employee salaries. Instead, they should be spending money on their programs. And actually, I think we need to shift that. If they spend money on salaries and they attract fantastic talent, then they're ultimately going to have a lot more impact on the beneficiaries that they're serving. So I think trying to think about nonprofits that maybe have that perspective means that you're ultimately going to end up in an organization full of fantastically smart people that are really passionate about what they do. And they're not necessarily having to sacrifice on their own quality of life for them or their families. So I think it is possible to work for nonprofits that pay. I think Founders Pledge, we kind of sit between like the tech world and the nonprofit world. And so they aim to pay, it's something like the top quartile for the nonprofit world, but at least top mid, like 50% of what the tech sector pays or something like that. So they're kind of positioning themselves between the two worlds. So I think looking for organizations that think a little bit differently is helpful as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, and the only other thing I would add is that I think one of the things that holds our sector back is an undue reliance on virtue and an insufficient reliance on competence or impact. Okay, so you know what I would strongly counsel against is going to work somewhere where the default position is we do this because we're good people, so don't ask us to be good at what we do. Okay, go to social enterprises where people are proud of the impact that they make. Okay, and take as read the fact that they're doing so in part for personal or ethical or justice reasons. Okay, and I think that's super important because virtue doesn't excuse incompetence or lack of impact. Okay, and associated with that set of questions are a whole set of questions around whether there really is a trade-off as between doing well and doing good. Okay, and I think, you know, if you do look at the top quartile of what you might call the impact economy in everything from finance to kind of NGO or disaster relief, I think what you'll see is that returns or rewards are being adjusted in exactly the way that Emily's just described. Not to the point where you get rich in the way you would if you were in an extractive industry. Okay, let's call it investment banking. Sorry, investment bankers. But I think it is changing. I think it is changing. And the very fact that we're having conversations about, you know, significant pools of investable capital, seriously thinking about how to align, as it were, the purpose of their investments with the return from those investments, tells you something about the nature of careers. If I had to guess, I would say that one of the growth sectors, if you set aside sectoral questions like exponential technologies and so on, will be precisely in the impact economy. Okay, and there are too few people who've thought hard enough about it, and therefore there are opportunities for people who have thought hard about it. People like our students and our graduates and so on. So I promised that you would get to ask us questions, and I have got a couple in the Q&A, but don't be shy. The next one is whether we think that moving around, jumping around is a strength of the social sector or a weakness. I guess I'm not sure that I recognize that it's more volatile than the private sector. I don't, or rather as I prefer to call it, the non-impact sector. I don't think it is, but I don't know if anyone has views about that. I mean, we four on this call have all moved. I mean, I moved from private sector to foundation world to university. Okay, I guess that's kind of three sectors, but I don't think three moves in a long life is out of the ordinary.
I'll jump in. I can't work out how to put up my hand, so sorry if I should be doing that, or I should just butt in. But I think it's from the sectors that I have worked in, it's only a strength. Like if I see someone that's is working in government now, and they have spent some time in the social sector or spent some time in a different country or spent some time in the private sector, from my perspective, and this is a personal perspective, I think that's a great thing. I think that if you see someone working in the Treasury who's working on business engagement and they worked in business for 5 years, that's a very positive reflection. I would agree with you, Stefan, that I think it's probably the echo chamber that we are in here, in the types of people that are on this call and the types of people that choose to do the masters, that we probably think that this is a really volatile space to be in. But actually, you have many people who've worked, you know, in the private sector their entire lives, and many people that work in the social sector their entire lives. I wouldn't say from my perspective there's a particularly different volatility between them, but I do think it's a massive strength, and it's one that is, as far as I can see from looking at a generational perspective, it's only becoming more and more common. We're working for longer, the accessibility is greater, and the encouragement that actually doing different things is better.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you know, in the old days, in private sector, in multinational private sector firms, the search firms looking for incoming chief executives would insist that someone had had multi-sectoral and multi-continental experience, even to be considered. I mean, before even shortlisting, you know, if they hadn't worked in the Americas and in Asia and on the African continent and in Europe, they wouldn't get looked at. And I think our world is a little bit like that. Sandra has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, I think I would agree. I do also think that there is, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be like jumping from like, you know, sector to sector, although I think that is a very healthy thing. So, you know, completely agree with Hannah. But I think even if you choose to, there's no pressure to do that. And if you choose to stay in your organization, I think it is healthy to move from like role to role, or like to move around the organization, just so you can get a really holistic perspective of everything. And I think that, again, would add to, you know, the work that you do and what you bring to the role. So I just wanted to add that bit as well.
I completely agree. I mean, I think many people on this call will be familiar with the ways the Amazon, which, you know, has its critics for obvious reasons, but at least can be said to have been very effective at doing the thing that it does. One of the managerial mantras at Amazon is, before any new project gets, as it were, a project plan, someone is asked to write the press release for that project, which clearly doesn't exist and doesn't have any resources, and so on and so on. And I wonder sometimes whether we should take an attitude a bit like that when we're thinking about ourselves. So instead of maybe a press release, since most of us are too modest, as it were, to write the press release about how wonderful our appointment is, it would be quite interesting to ask yourself, how does if you want to be an X or move to a Y sector, okay, put yourself in the minds of the people who can help you get there, and ask yourself what they would tell their colleagues or their board or their grantors or their investors. We're delighted because we've got Hannah, and Hannah comes to us from Deloitte, and she's been in New York, and she's got this turnaround finance experience, and so suddenly that person is off the hook. They're not going to get into trouble because they know what the answer is. And if you talk to the recruitment consultants, that's how they think. Okay, what will people say? You know, what will people say when they read about this in the trade press? You know, whatever the trade is, you know, whatever sector you're in. And I think it is quite important sometimes to think a bit about oneself in that mode. Hannah.
I was just going to completely agree and say that I kind of worked that out, I think, throughout the course. At the beginning, I thought I've got this CV and I can go wherever I want. And what happened, and Steph and I sat talking about it for quite some time, was that I was pigeonholed. People did read my CV, saw Deloitte, saw accountant, and they were like, perfect, you can work in the finance team. And I was like, I don't want to be in the finance team. That's not where I see my career going. But the framing is absolutely everything, because people will jump to conclusions, and if you don't help people make that transition of your skill set and how your skill set actually applies to different things, and finding the places in which you won't necessarily be pigeonholed and you can start to transition into something else away from what you were doing before, that's unfortunately no one's job but your own. And if you don't do it, no one will do it for you. And that was the thing at MSF. The job they gave me was a finance job. I could have run the finances for, I think, a country or multiple countries in an area. And it was that moment of being like, well, but that's not at all what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, Stefan, relating back to your kind of that framing, it's essential, and it's often incredibly hard to do yourself as well. So like, get some mates around, sit around and say, okay, when you read my CV, what do you think? And how can I change that if I want to change that?
Yeah. By the way, I mean it when I say be brave, ask us questions. I will check the Q&A box at regular intervals, but I just wanted to pick up something, and I can't remember if it was Emily or Sandra who mentioned this, which is about being a generalist, okay, and how you position yourself when you're a generalist. And I'll go back to you, Sandra, and ask you about this, but I think my view is, if you're a generalist, you need to be multilingual. Okay, you must know enough of the languages that are important in your world to be plausible across a range of things. You cannot be a generalist who is implausible across the generality of things. Okay, so nobody at the moment doesn't need to understand some measure of reputation, some measure of regulation, of policy formation, of money, and of technology, just to take 5 really simple things. Okay, now it doesn't mean that you have to be able to write code. It doesn't mean you have to be a policy wonk. It doesn't mean you have to be a PR person. But if you're not fluent in the generality of the things, then you're not going to pass any of the other tests that we've talked about. So one of the things we think really hard about on the master's program that we built is, how do we give people enough fluency across a range of things that are important to the world for them to be meaningful actors in the world? And that's super, super important, I think.
Yeah, totally. Very, very important. So maybe I will I'll share a little story, and that will bring it to life. So when I finished the program, I came into the program, just wanting to learn more about impact and how I could be better at my job. I wasn't necessarily actually looking to move continents or change roles. I was, well enough happy at my organization. And what happened was, I'm sitting in Dublin today, I kid you not, because of a ping on LinkedIn. If there are any Africans on the call, like my immediate thought, I said to my husband, I was like, do you think this is like a fraudulent, message? Because, I think you might not realize how you're coming across to the outside world. Like, you should definitely think about it for yourself in terms of like where you are and what you want people to see. But I think there's also a lens where people see you and see things about you that you might not even have noticed. So, I got this ping from LinkedIn. I was actually talking to my recruiter just today, just to say hi. She just got back from mat leave today. And I was, I think she saw something in me in terms of like my projection from consulting payment systems to telco to social enterprise, and then to what I'm doing now. So I think all of that combined built a certain framework of what she was looking for, and she felt that I fit that. I never in a million years, was thinking about, moving to Dublin or changing into core technology. But looking back at it now, a lot of my experiences and my roles have kind of led me to this point. So I think as you're looking inward, you should also leave room for people looking at you and figuring out where they think you can fit in and enhance the organization. So I think that's the way that it happened for me, and I think it's something to consider as well as folks are looking at what transition they would like to get into.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Joe Undirangu has asked us a question which I think is super important, and I'm really pleased, Joe, that you've raised this, because it's something I care a lot about. And the question, if I may paraphrase it, is, we talk a lot about impact as though it's its own thing, as though over there somewhere there's a sector called impact, as if it were like pharmaceuticals or retail. But what about if what you are about is making better the organizations across a whole road of sectors, within pharmaceuticals or retail? And I think this is important because I certainly don't wish to suggest that the impact economy is a separate thing. Okay, anybody who does anything needs to think about this stuff. And I guess, Emily, I mean, I know your founders are tech-ish, but that's a pretty broad spectrum, isn't it?
Massively broad. Yeah, we work with people that have, you know, med tech companies, SaaS companies, could be anything. And often with the people that we're working with, they're kind of trying to embed impact in their businesses, but they don't necessarily always have the full bandwidth to do it. And as they're scaling these businesses, I suppose they get more and more resources to be able to build out impact teams and things like that. But often they are making a commitment that, you know, whenever they sell the business or whenever they make money from the business, they will give back. And so I think even if you're not able to build out a full impact function within your organization, there are ways that you can embed it in some shape or form. And I think, at least I look at the course and a lot of the friends that I made on it, and many of them have done that. They've stayed within their organizations, but they've shifted to be the impact person, or the kind of person that is at least spearheading some of that work. And I think that also can be a really brilliant opportunity for you to develop as a leader within your existing organization, to say, hey, look, I've done this course, I've got all these amazing new skills and knowledge, and I want to use it, I want to bring it back into the organization. And so being that transition can be really brilliant as well.
So I'm very grateful to Joe for his question, because I think it's super important. Because if we're really serious about improving the state of the world, then we can't create a small local set of people who care deeply about this and let the whole of the rest of the world get on with doing stuff that doesn't care. We have to integrate these things into the mainstream, which means that markets, regulation, taxation, corporations, investment, everybody has to start thinking about impact adjusted returns. And that's very strongly a feature of our program. I wonder if just for the last couple of minutes, we could turn to some of the, I mean, the conversation has been quite philosophical and quite macro. I wonder if there are some more personal things about you having observed what kinds of people tend to excel in organizations, because I wonder too whether that is slightly changing. You know, whether we have to be, for example, better at listening than talking, when, you know, 40 years ago it might have been that we needed to be better at talking than listening. You know, it may be that we used to have this view of leadership as knowing answers. And we're kind of moving towards a view that says leadership is about trusting people and asking better questions, and so on and so on. And I'd quite like your reflections on that stuff, if it isn't too fluffy, a set of questions. Who's going to be brave on this one? I can, yeah, go, Sandra.
I can kick off, just because, like, honestly, this is such a bang on question for me, because this was literally a big part of my transition. So I went from like leading a team in Ghana, where the style of leadership, and guys, you guys remember like that, the course where we had the different types of leadership. I mean, that was literally my life. So I went from a style that was more like directive, that was more like, here's the framework of what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and let's get some thoughts and let's just go for it, to one that was very different, in terms of like you actually stepping back, you as the leader stepping back and almost, you know, if you will, like letting the team lead, right? Because they are the specialists, they know the partners, they certainly knew more about digital advertising than I did. And it was a style of more just asking the right questions rather than directing about what we're going to do. So it was really about co-creating together how this is going to go, how we're going to serve, you know, our partners, how we're going to make the impact, how we're going to measure the impact, and then how we're going to challenge each other and challenge the partners, right? So that for me was a bit of a learning curve for me, because yes, I had the building blocks from the course, which was fantastic, because I knew that, okay, Sandra, there's a shift happening here and you need to really change how you do things. But, you know, I made mistakes, I learned, and now we're in a place where I can really see the shift, right? So now if we're faced with, you know, a challenge or something that we're all working on together, you know, my immediate thing is to actually like sit back and like let everybody else speak and ask the questions and all of that, and then come back with, okay, I'm hearing XYZ. These are the 3 broad themes that are coming up. Is that correct? You know, what about this? What about this? And then that's how we come up with the solution together. So that was really a big, you know, part of my transition. And it goes back to, you know, my first point about having to like build up that capacity to really like scale that up. And I think if I had to, you know, just to conclude, like the words that have, you know, come to me very strongly in the last 2.5 years in this role is like grit, resilience, and really a lot of active listening.
Yeah. Yeah. Emily.
I think one of the things that Sandra said to begin with about like just asking stupid questions really resonates with me. I think often, at least for people that have been in a sector for a while, they just kind of, they use lingo and they talk about things in a particular way. And actually that's often evolved, and it's right to challenge that and right to ask people to explain why. So not being afraid to ask those stupid questions, no such thing as a stupid question. I think that is an example of how people do really well. And 2 other things that I suppose when I'm thinking from the nonprofit sector is actually applying more of what would be traditionally a private sector lens of being client orientated or beneficiary orientated, really thinking about what they want and what they need. And more importantly, following the data that tells you what that is, because often people don't necessarily know what they want or need, but the data and the kind of patterns and the trends that you're seeing will really help you to understand that. So yeah, having those client orientated, following data, and not being afraid to ask any questions. Yeah.
Hannah, anything to add on that stuff?
I guess I'll try and add the public sector perspective. It is probably transitioning and jumping between different jobs in the public sector is probably encouraged too much. It's kind of, I think Simon Case, the current leader of the civil service, had 5 jobs in 3 years or something. So like you can transition too much, I think. But I think from the public sector perspective, the key things for me, when you look at the leadership, so recently I kind of looked at, you know, people like Simon Case, people across the Treasury leadership group, you know, what are the things that they have in common that might indicate what signifies a good leader of an organization of this kind, as opposed to one, for example, like Deloitte. And I think all of them had that in common. The number of transitions, not necessarily quite to that extent, but everybody had been different departments, different places, often different sectors. And the key thread is that through that, from my perspective, is their ability to adapt, be flexible, change, and to listen. So when I was moving jobs from UK government investments into the Treasury, I bought a book. We haven't mentioned many books, but I don't know whether anyone's heard of it, but probably, but it's called The First 90 Days. And there are lots of amazing recommendations in it, but the key one from my perspective is what Sandra and Emily have both just said, which is asking questions and listening, because there will be so much that you don't understand about the new place, and the only thing you can do by kind of trying to make your mark as quickly as possible is end up falling flat on your face because you haven't understood the acronym, or you haven't, you know, understood the perspective of that particular stakeholder. So yeah, I think for me it's kind of adaptation and listening and learning from others.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good note to end on, I think. I mean, I think the last thing I wanted to say was, you know, I've seen, you know, not least the 3 people on this call with us, but I've seen hundreds of people who have made successful transitions. And the thing that they have in common, probably more than any other thing, is some degree of kind of modesty or humility. So they're modest enough to figure out what it is about the thing that they think they want to do that they could do. Okay, they don't simply presume that it's their right to have that transition enacted. So they work at it. Okay? And the other thing they have in common is the answer to the first question, you know, what do I really care about? Because if you don't know that, then you don't really know what thing it is that you want to be doing, okay, until you've lived through it and it's made you unfulfilled. And it's the hardest question of all to answer, what do I want? But it is a useful place to start. So we've come to the end of our time. I wanted to thank very much my three colleagues, Sandra, Emily, and Hannah. It's always a pleasure to see our former students, but when they're as articulate and have done such a good job of managing their own careers, it's a double pleasure. And I wanted to thank, as ever, Karina and Anna for getting us in the room and organizing this, and you for giving up an hour of your life to be part of this conversation. If there are things that you want to follow up, please let us know. If any of you want to follow in the footsteps of my colleagues on the call, then get in touch and figure out how you might join that class. And thank you all again.